There is a group of AIDS denialists that say that HIV does not exist and has never been isolated, which is as bizarre as it gets.
We do not say that HIV doesn't exist. What we say is that the presently available data does not prove the existence of HIV.
We weren't just given handfuls of AZT, we demanded it.
That's the very reason why everybody believed HIV is a deadly virus, because the HIV-positive patients at that time got a deadly treatment.
That is AIDS by prescription. You get immunodeficiency and you die from the tox. That is AIDS by prescription.
Hello everyone. You've just heard some clips from the documentary film House of Numbers, which questions the link between HIV and AIDS. More than this, it suggests the antiviral treatment for HIV, a drug called AZT, is itself responsible for a lot of the deaths attributed to the virus. Today's guest has been forced to confront these questions due to tragic circumstances in his own life. Jon Di Luca lost his mother to what he thought was the HIV virus. Years later, he questioned this after encountering the controversial work of Dr. Peter Duesberg, the final voice you heard during those clips. Jon is not approaching this as a professional scientist, rather he is a martial artist and writer. In this interview, he describes his journey right up to the point of coming to doubt viruses cause disease or even exist at all. I've no idea how far to go along that line. I'll leave it up to you, the listener, to decide for yourselves. Here's Jon explaining how this all began for him.
The sad part out of the way is that when I was just about to turn 14, my mom got diagnosed HIV positive, right? And the ensuing 5 years were her taking AZT, eventually having a pancreatitis attack and never really recovering from that, and then dying around like a month before my 20th birthday, right? So about 5, maybe 6 years after her diagnosis, right? So I'll get that part out of the way. That's the sad part. That's the part that affected my life drastically, you know, just losing my mother at that age, right? So, but, you know, first of all, there wasn't really that much internet back then. I wasn't really that confident in myself that I could figure out how to heal her. You know, I knew she was sick. I saw the AZT come into the house in bags with skulls and bones on them, and I was like, even at my like primitive mind at that age was like, Mom, this can't be good. Like, why are you taking this? You know, like there must be. At that age, I was a little bit interested in herbs and health. I used to go to the health food store. I went to the library and read books about factory farms, and I was in the mindset of like natural healing is better. I didn't really know why. I just had this like instinct towards that, but you know, it didn't really do anything. It was just, it didn't really affect her decision to take AZT. And I wasn't confident at the time that I could tell her, definitively don't take pharmaceutical drugs. I knew the pharmaceutical companies were corrupt because I knew industry is corrupt, basically, you know, from that age. Like my dad is a bit of a conspiracy theorist, at least in the sense of like not trusting the government, not trusting big corporations, like that kind of thing. So I had a bit of a background in not trusting the official story of take AZT. You know, that was it. That was all the doctor said, was take this drug, you know.
What kind of year are we talking here, Jon, when you were 14?
1990. She was diagnosed in 1990.
Okay.
And she died in 1995. So back then, like, I wasn't in New York. I'm from New York, but we moved to Florida after her diagnosis to live closer to my grandparents because, you know, she basically got a death sentence. So we had to move down to Florida to like spend the rest of her life around family, you know? And there, I didn't have access to like that much information. It was not a big city in Florida. It's kind of a suburb of Tampa, and there was a library, but like I said, my library experience led me to like books on veganism, on like factory farming, veganism, herbs, naturopathy. You know, I would look at natural medicine, but there was never a doubt that HIV, she contracted a virus called HIV that caused AIDS. I never had like a doubt about that at that age, you know?
Sure, it'd be nearly impossible to doubt that in like 1990, unless you're moving in some very unusual circles. It's not like today where the internet is full of this stuff.
Right. Maybe if I was still in New York, because I know up here there was groups, there was people already discussing that. But like, you know, I was 15, I was in high school, so I was just kind of crossing my thing. And I grew up Catholic. I grew up believing in God, and kind of like I would pray, like I hope, and I still believe in God, but in a different way, you know. But I would pray like for doctors to find a cure. That was my thing. I was like, maybe they'll find a cure, because there would be news sometimes like Magic Johnson never died. You know, there was always these like stories of some people survive, like, you know, some people live a long time. So like I was hanging on that hope. And then, you know, I got distracted by my own life in high school, like just trying to be a normal person. But there was a stigma. That's a stigma too. Like I can never really talk to people about my mother's disease, you know, especially this was still the 90s. It was a sexually transmitted disease. You know, it was like drug addicts and prostitutes and you know, like it was a disease that people made jokes about. It's a joke. Like people always joke about it. Oh, you got AIDS from drinking your drink, you know, that kind of thing. I had to like withstand all that, you know, and I jump around a lot. So if you want me to get back on track, just let me know.
No, that's fine. No, I think maybe say whatever you want to say, and we'll go in the direction of when your mind started to change, or where you started to consider other possibilities for what was going on with your mother's decline in health and ultimate death.
Right. So like I said, I have to keep acknowledging like my father's influence on my thoughts, because from when I was young, my dad taught me like the pharaohs of Egypt were aliens kind of things. He wasn't always 100% serious, but it was always, it's always a possibility that like things aren't what they seem on the news, right? So I'm going to skip ahead to 9/11 now, because I came back up to New York. That's a long story, but you know, I came back up to New York and I was living with my dad at the time, and this is 2001, 9/11, that day, right? And I was in Queens, so it wasn't really that close, but it was on TV and you could go outside and you could see like just people being, it was chaotic, you know? And I worked in Manhattan at the time, so I had to go back to work the next day because no one could get back there from Brooklyn, right? So they needed me because I lived in Queens. I was a waiter. So I was waiting tables on 9/12 the next day, right? So, but anyway, going back, my father, we watched on TV the whole morning of 9/11, the news. And, you know, my dad is kind of a pothead and we smoked together, and we were just sitting there thinking like, this is so, I don't want to use the word fake, but this is so, obviously they had these graphics ready. This thing is like, this is presented to us in a certain way that we're supposed to feel a certain way. And it looked fake, suspicious, right? So 9/11 had something to do with this, because I'm going to skip ahead now another 5 years, 3 or 4 years. I was living in Manhattan, and I used to go by Barnes & Noble a lot, the bookstore, and I saw a David Icke's book in there, and on 9/11. So I just started looking through it, and I was like, yeah, this guy makes sense. And the whole, you know, reptilian thing, like I said, my dad was kind of an ancient aliens in his own way kind of theorist. So I would think like Anunnaki makes sense to me. It makes sense to me that the Babylonians were like worshiping alien, you know, not that it makes sense, but it wasn't that far fetched to me.
Sure.
You know, I took it kind of as amusing too. Like I didn't read it and think like, oh my God, I have to fight shape-shifting reptilians. But anyway, so I ended up going to like a screening of a 9/11 documentary. I think it was Loose Change, but I'm not really 100% sure. I don't remember. There was a few of them. And there was a guy there that was selling these booklets. And one of the booklets was an excerpt, a big excerpt from Peter Duesberg's book, Inventing the AIDS Virus. And I read that, and it really like changed my whole life in a way, because I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, you know. And I took it in my own way. Like I ended up reading the booklet and then going online and like reading Peter Duesberg's interviews, trying to find more excerpts from the book, because I couldn't find it at the time, and I wasn't really that versed in how to find books online and that. So I read as much as I could from his interviews and all that. And I basically postulated, like in my own mind, like, okay, the HIV, whatever HIV is, whatever they say it is, there was obviously many other factors in my mother's sickness than this little monster getting inside her, hijacking her, and whatever they say it does. Like there was many other factors involved. And then AZT was the biggest factor, you know, because I don't want to like share too much personal information, but you know, my parents definitely dabbled in drugs, right? And intravenous drugs, you know, they weren't shy about needles, you know. So I knew that from a young age, because I was around it and I saw it, and I always knew that like drugs of that nature were not healthy. You know, I knew like you can't do heroin, you can't shoot heroin and expect to be healthy. Like I knew that. That's like a no-brainer, right? So recognizing that plus AZT, I just was like, well, there's no real need to have this postulation of an invisible little monster that kills people. That doesn't seem logical to me anymore. So at that point in my life, I basically just took it in myself, like, I don't believe in viruses, at least to the point where what they say viruses are, I don't believe that, right? But I didn't really talk about it to people unless I was close enough to talk to them about my own life, my mother dying and stuff. I didn't walk around telling people, you know, viruses don't cause illness. Like I wasn't that kind of person. It wasn't until COVID where like I had to, out of self-defense, because like my life was like totally sidetracked and sidelined by this media blitz of like virus. And I was like trying to tell everybody I know, I was like, viruses don't exist, man. And then at that point, once COVID started, then I jumped into the research of viruses, germ theory, everything in general. Like I was reading like 4 hours a day, all these books, you know. Anyway, I'm going to stop because I'm rambling, but you can just guide me in a direction if you want.
Sure. No, I mean, I think there's some interesting points there. So Peter Duesberg's work, I've just read it, and I've kind of read it because I wanted to anyway, but also in preparation for having this conversation. And it's a fascinating book, right? Where as you'll know, Peter Duesberg goes for examples of things we thought were viruses and weren't. Like I didn't know how long people thought scurvy was a virus for. Like right into the 20th century, people were looking for still the dreaded scurvy virus. And when there would be an outbreak of scurvy on a sailing ship, they would isolate the person to hope it wouldn't spread. And then it would, of course, spread anyway. And they knew that citrus fruits kept it at bay. But they thought the citrus fruits are helping fight the virus, not that scurvy literally was a deficiency in vitamin C. And that's all there is to it. So you're reading about the toxicity of AZT. Now, for one, I imagine, and just, you know, like you don't want to go too personal. I don't want to take you too personal, but it must be like really hitting you on a personal level that what you've had this narrative about your mother's illness and death. And then you come across Peter Duesberg's work when you're kind of minding your own business going to a 9/11 meeting, and all of a sudden you've got this complete paradigm shift in what brought that about. And I can see how you make that step then to thinking, well, drug culture became a much more prominent thing in the 70s and 80s, and that's obviously going to have some effect on the population. And then AZT itself is toxic and kills people. So that must be then what happened? But then you go that extra step of, well, actually, you don't think viruses exist at all in some sense. So maybe just comment on your journey there at a sort of personal and intellectual level.
Yeah, sure. Well, just, you know, even from when I was a kid, like I was never germophobic. Like I'm not disgusting. Like I don't like, like I'm not like into disgusting things, but I never believed like if I was around someone, especially someone I loved, like, you know, I shared a room with my mother till I was like 13, 14, right? So like my mom would be sick, she would have a cold, I would have a cold, like, you know, I never, if there was a girl I liked in high school or something, you know what I mean? I never was thought that if someone was sick, I was going to get sick from being around them. If I didn't like them, I would use that as an excuse to not have to be around them. But if I liked someone, I was never like, oh, I can't be around you because your nose is running. Like I never thought I was going to get sick from those things. Like that was, and like if I dropped food on the floor, like I would pick it up and eat it. Not if it fell in shit, but if it just fell on the floor, I would pick it up and eat it, right? So I never really was germophobic in the first place, right? Even with washing my hands, like I was never like a freak about washing my hands. I've never used hand sanitizer in my life, right? So I mean, it might just be a bit of a way of being, you know. Like I just never germophobia never sunk in. I never knew what people were talking about when they said there's a virus, there's you know, like a thing that flies through the air. When you get sick, it comes into your body. Like those things never sunk into me to where I believed them that much in the first place. I just didn't give it that much thought because I was health conscious anyway, because I liked being healthy for activities like martial arts or sports. You know, I didn't want to be fat. Like I was fat when I was a kid. So like once I wanted to like not be fat or be healthy, be strong, be, you know, athletic in some way. So I wasn't really ever sick that much anyway. But to articulate it to other people, I would just sound like I sound now. Like I just sound like a regular person who's saying like, I don't believe in germs, you know, and they'll say, well, what's your scientific evidence to back that up, right? It wasn't until COVID that I felt like I had to really develop a vocabulary to discuss it with other people. You know what I mean? Like, but at the baseline of my personality, of how I perceive the world around me, this idea that there's like pathogenic terror, like little pathogenic terrorists, and they cause disease, never really fully made sense to me in the first place. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So there's this intuitive sense that's not the case. And then let's then talk about what happened when COVID hit. Because I think it's quite a distance to go over the line into, oh, okay, this is true, and viruses don't exist.
Right,
so
okay.
What was the kind of intellectual journey that took you down that road and ultimately over the line into like, affirming that position?
Okay, well, at the time when COVID, I was practicing Aikido. It's a Japanese martial art really intensely for like 18 years. That was kind of my focus in life, is that I wanted to eventually have my own dojo, and like I was really a serious practitioner of Aikido. But when COVID hit, like my dojo closed, and then they did Zoom classes, and I just was like, I'm not doing Zoom classes, especially because when COVID hit, I didn't believe the news. I didn't believe, this is ridiculous. Whatever they're saying on the news is ridiculous. Like I just know it's a psyop. I didn't even know the word psyop yet at that point, but I knew it was a psyop, you know. But okay, so at that point, I had a lot of time on my hands to just like contemplate like what's really going on, you know, or contemplate and research and educate myself a little bit more. And I found David Crow. There's a guy named David Crow, and he had a podcast and a website with like his writings about viruses in general. So David Crow was really my introduction to this idea that there's like viruses. The hypothesis of a virus has never been scientifically proven enough for us to just take it and run with it as like the linchpin of a cosmology. Like, okay, there's these things that fly through the air that come into your body and hijack your cells and kill you, right? They're they're looking for the evidence of that kind of helps you formulate the fact that, okay, that sounds like a ridiculous story. And what they're doing is filling in that story with like a scientific sounding nomenclature, the scientific sounding words that might link up in sentences grammatically, but that actually don't point to any like logical activities happening in the real world. So just like, I guess I just have to tell you, like, the doctors that I've been reading and thinking about is like Tom Cowan, Andrew Kaufman. David Crow is not a doctor, but he's a scientist. You know, he's Stefan Lanka. Like, you know, there's plenty of information out there that you could read and weigh it against the official story. Like, I really like your concept of like, compared to what? Like, in terms of, is George Bush a shape-shifting reptilian compared to what? Like, what's the other representation of him, right?
Sure. Yes, that was a philosophical, just to say for the audience, that was a philosophical point I made in my Contemplating Conspiracy book. And I think I used it in terms of the virus and saying, well, if let's say the no virus people are wrong, sometimes they're compared to the virus people, they're right, you know, because they were right in terms of scurvy, for example. So, they make a lot of interesting points, and they can be right about points when you see so for me, when COVID hit, I was very cynical, having lived through swine flu and bird flu and tomato flu and all the others. It's another money grab by the pharmaceutical companies and another power grab by the state. But then when I saw the death rate spike, and it, like, for a few weeks doubled in the UK and across various European countries, that sold it to me. And I was, okay, yeah, there really is a dangerous virus going around. Now, it didn't sell the concept of lockdowns, because anyone who's in any way economically literate knows that there's going to be unintended consequences to that. And sure enough, the canary in the coal mine is always the Africans. An additional 10,000 African kids started dying, starving to death every month as soon as you interrupt supply chains and lock them down and put the global food price up. But for the longest time, I did think there was a virus. And it was really coming into contact with the book Virus Mania that made me start to question that. Okay, I started to even put it, and when that point was made in the book, it's not even that I believed it when I got to the COVID chapter, but it was one of those things that's so radical that I was listening to the audiobook, I had to hit pause and just stand there and look at the world around me and all the chaos that had gone on of people walking around with masks and lockdowns and all the rest over, well, probably like 9 months into it at this stage. I'm thinking, what if, like, wouldn't that be the most incredible thing if this just wasn't a thing, right? If it didn't exist. And they give an example of there's something like the Seattle windshield event, right? Where people started noticing cracks on their windshields in Seattle in the 60s. And then there was this whole investigation into what it was, whether it was unusual weather platforms or some chemical in the windshields they're putting in now, or whether the Russians had some sort of super weapon they were using against the West Coast of the United States. And it turned out that a few people initially did this, reported to the radio, and then everyone started examining their windshields in great detail. And what do they find? Amazingly, there are all these little cracks on people's windshields. So to me, that kind of thinking really appeals, because if this podcast has an underlying concept, it's about perception, about how we look at something changes what that thing is in a very substantial way. So yeah, that was incredible to me. But I'm sort of still hung up on that question of what caused those death spikes in early 2020. And I don't think I've gotten over the line of that yet. But the other thing I'm struck by is I'm amazed that this conversation even exists. You can have like a field of virology if viruses don't exist. You can have all these medical professionals disagreeing, and some of them are looking at down a microscope and saying, look, it's right there. That's the virus there. I can point to it. And other people are saying, no, that's meaningless because it's not meaningfully isolated. And you can't look, it's amazing this question cannot be like settled, right? To the extent that it still draws in people with all sorts of medical degrees and qualifications. You know, it is quite distinct from, like, let's say, a flat Earth debate there, where you don't have physicists and mathematicians supporting flat Earth, but you do have a lot of doctors who either think viruses don't exist, or, for example, the HIV virus isn't causing AIDS, some variation of that. So, yeah, maybe just say a bit more about, well, and we want to comment on what I've just said, but on what sort of brought you over the line into that view, and how you would think to approach that, given that I never feel qualified to comment on, like, when someone puts a picture up of, like, this is what a virus is based on an interpretation of what's down in an electron microscope. So what do you think is a good way to go about that in terms of finding some sort of truth in it?
Sure. I just want to comment real quick on the spike in deaths, right? I live in New York City. I live in Queens, but close to the city, 20 minutes from Manhattan by train, and we would watch the news and see just red numbers of deaths and dying, right? I would still go out every day, and I would hang out in the park. I have friends, like, I would hang out in the park and go by hospitals. I would walk past hospitals and look at them, and there was long lines outside, right? But there wasn't people dropping dead on the lines in the street, right? And I'm cynically just attribute the spike in deaths to the care of the people who were scared shitless going to the hospital, thinking, I'm gonna die. There's this I just caught this deadly disease. I'm gonna die. People who have symptoms, the symptoms were endless. They gave you a list of every single symptom there could be, and people are they're scared. They go to the doctor, they go to the hospital, and the nursing homes. I mean, I can't dwell too much on that, because that would make me crazy to really go into the nursing home deaths. Like, I always say, if I had a relative that was in a nursing home at that time, and they wouldn't let me go see them, and they wouldn't tell me what was going on, I would break in and steal them and kidnap them and just deal with the consequences,
Yeah, people in the UK have done that, not just during COVID, but with the end of life pathways things. Essentially, the UK has always had a covert euthanasia program. People have had to break into nursing homes and hospitals and get their relatives out. There's a famous chef in the UK, Rusty Lee, who did that to get her elderly aunt out. And then, because she's famous, she was talking about doing it on the BBC. Sorry, it's a bit of a digression there.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Is like, what do you do with the information they're giving you? They're telling you all these people are dying, and they're also telling you the cause at the same time. The cause is this virus that's flying through the air, and people are catching it, and everyone's dying from it, right? So if they're telling you all these people are dying, and they also tell you the cause, don't mistake disbelieving the cause for the people that are dying, right? I never doubted that people are dying. I never doubt that people are sick. Like, I walk around and look at people. They're sick, a lot of sick people. You could just see by the way they walk, just people look very unhealthy right now. But I was always amazed at the people wearing the masks, standing outside Popeyes waiting for chicken sandwiches, fried chicken, like, I was always amazed that people can't make that connection in their mind that, like, the food that you're eating is what's making you sick. The shit that you're drinking and eating, and the chemicals, the spray in the air, I don't even get too deep into all that. But to look for the cause of sickness and then start with this idea that there's an invisible terrorist, to me, is looking past so many other causes of sickness.
Okay, in general, yes, John, but when there's, like, the food people are eating is not making them massively more sick in April of 2020, right?
No,
so
but the psychological trauma of watching the news and seeing these nonstop images of death and hospitals, like, that would push people who are already unhealthy. This is just my opinion based on, my lifetime of eating, like, very healthy and taking care of myself and never really getting sick, like never getting a flu or a cold. Like, I say never hyperbolically, but so I might be biased in this, thinking like, well, I'm not sick, so why are other people sick? And then I would just say, well, just stop eating fried food, stop eating cake, stop eating all these things and see how you feel, but that's just, that might be my personal bias. So I apologize if I'm pushing that in there.
No, it's okay. I mean, I think there are plausible mechanisms that, other than a virus, that could drive up the death rate. So initially, just a few months after that, there were reports in the UK media of how the government had handled the virus in terms of they emptied out the hospitals because they were expecting an influx. They emptied it out into the old people's home. But that still confirms the viral hypothesis. So you put all these people who are carrying COVID into the old people's home, and then it's just a slaughterhouse in there, because you've essentially the government essentially did exactly the opposite of what it should have done according to its own principles, where you're supposed to isolate and protect the elderly, and they did exactly the opposite of that. They put all the sick in with the elderly and then locked them in the building together. So that was interesting.
Does it? But I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. But does it prove the viral, or does it support the viral, or does it? If you're thinking about it another way, does it also show you that the psychological trauma that these people were exposed to, and being shoved together in a room, telling them that they all possibly have a life-ending disease, like telling all these already sick and old people, subjecting them to this psychological trauma, can you discount that in favor of a particle that they don't get an electron microscope? Like, can you believe an electron microscope without knowing how it works, without knowing the process of what they put, the things that they look under the electron microscope, the process that they put that through, and then saying it's the same thing that they think they're going to see, and they see it and they say, oh, that's it, you know?
Okay, I'll come back to that. I want to ask you about that process it goes through. So just to sort of wrap up on this, you can't discount anything, because when, like, my overriding point is when you change a complex system, you can't do it in a predictable way. Like, it moves to reset itself. So, for example, if you just like you just said, when you announce a virus is coming, the death rate might go up just because of stress, just because you're telling people now they're ill with this dangerous virus. Or, as I think happened in the UK, and I've heard this from Canada too, when hospitals think they're going to get full of people coming in with a virus, they put people on end-of-life care pathways a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Essentially, they euthanize people. And that seems to have happened in various jurisdictions. And the other one is the medical trials, right, where they put people on toxic doses of hydroxychloroquine. Now, when I interviewed Meryl Nass, she said, absolutely, that happened. But she doesn't think it's substantial enough to impact the death rate. I find the psychological factors very intangible, right? It's hard to kind of nail them down and say, well, how much of a death rate increase would you expect from psychological factors? I think that's like, and you could also say like stress of like being locked down and
well, that's what I mean. I'm including stress in with psychological. I just mean the trauma. Trauma.
Sure. Having highlighted that, maybe I would like to ask you about this other factor of what I hear from the no virus camp, and this is like quite new information to me, so I'm only attempting to get my head around this now, is this idea of meaningful isolation. So I heard Tom Cowan give an analogy, and I understood the analogy, but I don't understand necessarily the details of how it applies to virology. So he talked about how, like, if someone drinks a cup of coffee and they become kind of hyperactive or in their mind, does that prove that caffeine causes that? And the obvious answer is no, because you've got boiling water, you've got milk, you've got whatever else is in with the coffee, in the bean. So to prove that, you would have to isolate specifically caffeine and have a double-blind test where you give caffeine to 100 people and something that like inert to another 100 people and compare the difference. Okay, and without that, you cannot say caffeine is a stimulant. The what I'd say is, like, so you see where I'm going with this. The virus has not been meaningfully isolated because it's mixed in of all these different things. So can you explain that a bit, please? What's meant when people say that?
Yeah, I'm going to do it as a layman, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I'm going to if I stumble over some words, like, just forgive me. But as far as I know, and I'm only going by what anyone else can read, you know, not just internet, but books and, you know, CDC's own website, like whatever. What they claim that they're doing when they isolate a virus, first of all, they're assuming its existence first, right? They're not taking a substance, takes mucus, phlegm. They'll take phlegm. They're not just looking through the phlegm without presupposing that there's a virus in it. So they're looking for a virus in it, right? And then they're using all this complex genetic, like, vocabulary to discuss how they do that. And you know what I mean? Like, there's no, like, here's the phlegm, let's filter it, find a particle, take just that particle. Now, as far as I know, Dr. Kaufman says that they're able to isolate other particles of the supposed size of a virus, right? I can't verify that. I'm not like a lab person. I don't know. But if that's the case, if they're able to isolate other particles of that size, And isolate means take it by itself, but they don't do that. They haven't done that, right? As far as I know, they haven't done that. What they do instead is they make a cell culture, and they claim to be culturing. They take the whole substance, the phlegm, or maybe not fully the phlegm, but they say they'll isolate part of it. I don't know how you can isolate part of something and not just the thing that you say is there. And then they'll make in a test tube or in a petri dish or however they do it, they make a culture, and they claim that the culture has virus in it, and they can witness the virus killing the cells, right? So they're not, the isolation needs to be, there's a particle, they say there's a particle, they can isolate things at that size. Why don't they isolate that particle, take just that particle, put it into the mix and see what happens, and then say what it is? They're defining that it exists first, not isolating it, and then claiming that the experiment that they're doing is proving that it exists because the cells die. And again, supposedly, I only say this because I read it and I read about it. Stefan Lanka did a control experiment that shows that the same experiment could be done without taking a supposedly viral like load of phlegm or whatever and putting it into the dish. The cells still die because of the way they're treated, because of all the other stuff that goes into this process is insane. When you read it, when you go and like read one of these papers that says how they isolated a virus, it makes like it's nomenclature, like it's sophistry, like it's just a bunch of crazy shit. And then when you read it, you say, well, how does that prove that there's a little particle that you could take from one person, put it in another person, and then it hijacks their cells and starts doing all this wild shit? Like, they're not showing that. Sorry.
No, that's great. That's really, I mean, that's the point I zoomed in. Now, I listened to a load of Tom Cowan's podcasts where either he himself was talking about this or he was interviewing people on the subject. And that's what I zoomed in on, that point about isolation, because it moves from the complexity of what's going on under an electron microscope to a point of pure logic. Because with the coffee example, you could put caffeine under an electron microscope at as much magnification as you like. If you've not isolated it, it's irrelevant, right? So I'm certainly not able to come down on one side or the other of that argument. But to me, this question of isolation seemed to be the place to go if you wanted to make headway with it.
Yeah, headway with which side? You mean headway, and like if they just showed how they isolated? And I think a lot of the people who came out during COVID now that are like kind of in the camp of like what they call like virus deniers, whatever, a lot of them would actually shut up and take it because a lot of them are very like just scientifically minded, and you could tell like they're looking for something and they're not finding it. And I think if they found what they were looking for, they would admit, okay, that makes sense now. But the official story of virology there's so many holes in it logically that if you have a logical mind, even like a semi-logical mind like mine, like there's just so many holes in it, I would be just constantly asking a virologist, what about that? What about that? But that doesn't make any sense, and like, why would you, like they want you to doubt that about yourself in a way so that you just don't take it that far and wonder like, so the word virus originally means poison, right? They presupposed its existence a long time ago. There's whole books you can read on the history of how virology came to be and how they couldn't discover the protein they were looking for, so they kind of scrapped the whole thing. And then genetics, quote unquote genetics, whatever, eugenics, I guess I have to say that I don't resist the idea too much that there are eugenicists that are just experimenting on people and doing like crazy vile shit. So that's why like it might it might affect my ability to look at things completely down the middle and say, well, I might be wrong, because I might be wrong, but you can stop me anytime.
No, that's fine. I mean, that's what I think. Like, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I think they're raising like very interesting questions, and I'm learning a lot from looking at it. So that's my like interest in it. One more question on this point. Go on, sorry.
Okay. No, just look at the mechanism that they say they've just the COVID, the TV drama of COVID. When you watch the news, I used to watch the mainstream news just to see what they were saying. And, how does it fly through the air? It attaches to little aerosol droplets. And then is it alive or is it dead? Like even virologists say, is the virus alive or is it not alive? And it's dead until it goes into your body, but it could fly through the air and come in, and then it comes back to life. And then they replicate by the billions. There's billions of them in your body, but the scientists still can't isolate them. It can't there's not enough of them to isolate. But sorry, go ahead.
Well, my final question on this topic, then we've got a couple to round up, is there anything that makes you think, no, wait a minute about this? And I just think, I had measles as a kid, right? And I don't know how else I would explain that.
Pox.
I had that too.
It could be a speculative explanation. But
yeah, that'd be fine. Yeah, because we understand we're doing that. Yeah.
So, okay, we're an organism, right? We're whatever you believe of what our purpose is here as living beings, we're born and we have this potential of our whole life is in I don't know if you know James Hillman, he compares it's like an acorn,
James Hillman, a Jungian psychologist.
Yeah, he went a little bit further than Jung on some things, but this acorn metaphor, and it's not just the physical, it's our spiritual too. It's like our soul is like an acorn, right? And we have this whole potential life ahead of us. So we're going to grow into this being, right? Like we're a baby. Before we're a baby, we're an embryo. We have all this potential to grow into something. And there's this growth process that's already it's not predestined, but there's the potential of this growth process. So even while we're an embryo, we have this type of information in us that when we're 7 years old, it's going to know what to do to kick off the next growth spurt, right? We keep growing for 20 years. You know what I mean? That's crazy. And there's things in our body that do that. We don't do it, right? So maybe just from the terrain, my bastardized version of what terrain is, our body is doing these things for us, right? And there's a detox mechanism. And maybe at 6 years old, 7, 5, maybe at that age, we're about to go into another growth spurt, and our skin, something to do with our skin is about to kick in, right? To give us a new layer of skin. And maybe at that point, we grow up in this Western diet of eating Captain Crunch for breakfast and bagels and donuts and pizza and all this shit. At that age, maybe we're already toxified. And so when that detox system kicks in, we develop these symptoms, right? And if there are other kids around us at the time, they're the same age as us. They're in the same school. They drink the same pasteurized, disgusting milk that they gave us in school. They drink the same chocolate milk. They drink the same high C and eat the same Lunchables or whatever kids eat. We're all in the same mess. We're all in the same sewage system, right? So people exhibiting symptoms at the same time, to me, is not that difficult to fathom. Even chickenpox, even measles, even those things.
Sure. Well, I mean, it is what happened with scurvy, essentially. People exhibiting symptoms at the same time in a confined environment. So yeah, I take you. I mean, it's an interesting, I don't know if I should say conjecture or explanation. It's fascinating. Yeah.
It is a conjecture because I don't know what.
Sure. Okay. Penultimate question, John. How do you see the dialogue around this subject emerging? And I'll just put some meat on the bone there. For me, I've been involved in 9/11 truth for I've had an interest in it since 9/11, and a few years ago I became more interested in it when I interviewed a fellow New Yorker of yours, Adam Fitzgerald, for a series. And what I saw on that is amongst people who are opposed to the state narrative, there becomes division and breakdown along ideological lines and an absence of flowing information over those lines. So in some ways, in ways that like weirdly directly parallel what we're seeing now. So there's the Al-Qaeda doesn't exist camp, and there were no hijackers on the planes. It was all remote controlled. And then there's the who said, no, Al-Qaeda does kind of exist, but they're soft puppets of the CIA, and the guys who are on the planes as kind of patsies. Then no, Al-Qaeda really exists as an independent organization, and the CIA funds them, but they got out of hand. And that's where 9/11 came from. And you have this, like, in some ways, healthy breakdown or healthy division of people taking different perspectives, but it becomes very toxic in that there's no communication. Everyone gets very attached to their ideologies. And I see that now emerging. And this is what I tried to bring up in my interview with Dr. Meron Nass about, particularly along the opposition to COVID breaks down along, there's a dangerous virus out there, which has clearly caused a spike in the death rate, or there is no virus, and it's our own interventions that are causing the spike. And people get very, like, attached to either position, I suppose, and quite defensive of both positions. Maybe for good reason. Like, maybe half of them have good reason. But how do you see that kind of that division in the narrative?
Yeah. So specifically about COVID, with 9/11, I can't speak on too much because I just know that whatever the
I mean specifically on COVID and this virus question.
Yeah, whatever George Bush said wasn't true. That's all I know. But with COVID specifically, it boils down to personality types for me, right? Like, I feel like there's a certain personality type that likes James Bond movies, and they want the bioweapon thing to be true, right? They want this. It's like, I call it like poli-sci fiction. It's like a political science fiction that people live in. Like, there's, an evil group of scientists that develop this super weapon and I'm not saying that that's not true, that there are evil scientists who invent bioweapons. I totally agree with that, right? But that's taking precedence over like another personality type, which I would consider myself, is where, like, I'm a little bit obsessed with feeling healthy and physically fit, in a sense, right? Like, so to me, I'm taking it as, well, what does this all mean from a total natural health standpoint? What does it mean to be healthy? What do I eat? How do I feel when I eat? And what symptoms do I exhibit if I'm ever sick? And how does that compare with other people I see who just eat regular food and just do whatever, right? So I think the people who focus on the things that I'm talking about, or like purely logic, like trying to find like just taking apart the sentences that they're being told, that's another personality type that I'm a little bit of. Like, I'm a little bit of like a logical, like, detective type. Like, someone tells me a story, I start like taking apart their sentences and looking for clues as maybe they're not telling me the whole story, like that kind of thing. So I feel like the division is more of a personality type. Like, you don't want to look that deep into what a virus is defined as. Not you, I'm just saying in general.
Yeah.
The word virus tends to substitute for bioweapon. So then when you hear people saying there's no virus, you think they're saying there's no bioweapon. And okay, I shouldn't say you, sorry. So
no,
when
okay. The audience understand. Yeah.
Okay, so that you hear there's no virus, you think there's no bioweapon, and you think these people are crazy because what's killing these people? What are people dying from? Then with AIDS, people say there's no virus, you think that means there's no disease, there's no illness, and that people think you're crazy. They say, how can you say there's no virus? But I think it just has to do with personality type. Like, if you want there to be Fauci in the bio lab taking HIV virus and genetically, like, doing all that stuff, which may be happening, but that still doesn't mean that there is a pathogen in nature that passes between people that does what they say their bioweapon does. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So as far as the division between people, I think, like, people who don't trust the corporate government, people who don't trust the official narrative of corporations and the government and the World Economic Forum and all that shit, people who don't trust that should all just agree they don't trust that. But, like, all the other personality types have to coexist. So there's germophobic people. If people are germophobic, they could still distrust fascism. what I call fascism is like the corporate government. Like you can still distrust that and be germophobic. I don't have a problem with that. But if you want to have the conversation of do viruses exist, I'm going to have the conversation and we could talk about it for a long time. And I might never convince you if you're germophobic, you know? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. So my final question, I wanted to ask, going back to the question of HIV and AZT, have you experienced any pushback? Because one of my reticences, or something that makes me a bit reluctant to get involved in this whole debate, is dealing with kind of complex medical issues. And there's quite a strong pushback about claiming HIV doesn't cause AIDS or calling AZT toxic is a dangerous thing to do. Because you could and claims that people who have made that, like Peter Duesberg, Peter Duesberg, right? People call him a murderer.
Yeah.
Right? Because he said that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, and you follow that logic, whether he's directly saying it or not, and he is directly saying it. The logic is you don't take AZT because AZT is a toxic drug. Do you have any comments on the nature of that discussion and those kind of what's clear is that somebody's a murderer. Okay, there's definitely a murderer in the room, and we're trying to establish who it is. Is it Peter Duesberg, or is it Anthony Fauci and Robert Gallo and the people pushing AZT for HIV, for AIDS? What do you think about that?
Well, presented to it that way, I would say that Fauci is more of a murderer. I don't think that either of them are like really liable for people's individual lives and deaths. I think they should be, maybe Fauci should be held responsible, but I mean, the people make their own choices in life, right? And that's a hard thing to just obviously start a conversation off with, is that people make their own choices. But in terms of if someone wants to take AZT because they believe in, it's a cosmology, it's a worldview. You believe that you ignore what you eat and drink. You ignore how you live your life. You go to an office or you work at like some kind of insurance company or whatever people do, and you work there and you sit there and you hate your life, and then you go out to eat and you eat all this food that's like not nutritious at all, and you stress, and your life is just one big stress thing. And then you go to the doctor and they tell you have a disease and take this medicine and this medicine will help you. Right? There's those people that is a majority of people, and to shock them out of that cosmology it's not for everyone. So if there's like even my mother, like I wasn't able to convince my mother to stop taking AZT. I might not have had the arsenal that I have now if I could go back and be like, Mom, listen, just this. You trust these drug companies? I would just start with that. You trust these companies? You see how much they're sued? You know what I mean? Like I would start with that and then work in the nutrition aspect. Like I'm a little bit extreme. Like I went raw vegan for like 5 years once, and I know how it feels to feel like a chimpanzee. Like I could climb trees in 5 seconds. You know what I mean? I understand that's ridiculous, but at the same time, like you understand how your body actually works. And some people don't want to jump into that. They want to stay in that other paradigm of like, no, Chips Ahoy is food. You just eat Chips Ahoy. It might make you fat, but it's not going to make you sick. You can go to Dunkin' Donuts. It might make you fat, but it's not going to make you sick. So, you could drink Mike's Hard Lemonade. It might make you drunk. It might make you fat, but it's not going to make you sick, right? And then the sickness is always attributed to a thing. It's genetic. It's viral. It's this. And they make up this whole vocabulary, and this whole industry is built around making products that they can sell you to make sure you're not sick while living the lifestyle that you want to live. So I would always boil it down to like a lifestyle. Like if you really, I'm not going to tell someone not to take AZT if they also don't want to like know about nutrition and health and things like that. Like that's not fair to them. Does that make sense?
And I'll definitely want to have you back on to explain the running up trees like a monkey thing. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, sure.
Anything else you want to mention now, please do. Otherwise, I think this has been great, and thank you very much.
All right, it's my pleasure. After I heard you on Alex's show, I went back and listened to your show because I had never heard of it, and I listen to almost every episode, probably. It's really
Oh,
good.
well, that must make you a rare group of people. Well, thank you for that, and great. We'll speak again.
All right,
Thank you.
take care. Take care, man. Bye.